When I was a kid, everybody knew that the best type was Psychic, because the strongest and coolest Pokemon ever was Mewtwo, a Psychic type. If you needed more proof, Mew was the only mythical Pokemon, a classification so rare you could only get one by going to a store that no longer exists. But somewhere between my bright childhood and today's bleak wind reality, something changed, and Psychic fell from the best type in the game to maybe not the absolute worst, but pretty close to it. Today, I'm gonna break down how Pokemon ruined the Psychic type. Every generation, we get new Pokemon of every type, whereas how the actual types interact with one another stays the same. Or that's how it worked the last 3 generations. But to fully understand what happened to the Psychic type, we can't start with Generation 7. We need to go all the way back to the Kanto region in Pokemon Red and Blue. The year is 1996, and Pokemon has just been released with 151 unique creatures, launching the series to unprecedented success as Pokemon fever infects everyone except for this guy.
So Pokemon is a game that teaches children how to enter into the world of witchcraft, how to cast spells, how to use psychic phenomena. Your children need to know there's a devil and he hates them and he wants to ruin their life.
Naturally, the developers started doing what any good game company would do, working on a sequel, which means an opportunity to not only expand the game with new Pokemon, new locations, and new mechanics, but also to correct anything that was out of line in the first games. And there is one issue that is so blatantly game-breaking that even the developers who keep ignoring Incineroar couldn't possibly leave it untouched. The Psychic type is completely overpowered. This has to do with more than just Mewtwo. A type strength is determined by 2 things: the strength of the Pokemon that have that type, and how the actual types interact with each other. In Generation 1, Psychic type Pokemon were, as the kids say, amazeballs. Alakazam was one of the strongest Pokemon in the game, and Pokemon like Starmie, Jinx, Slowbro, even Mr. Mime were so good they'd make Rillaboom look Rillaboomed. If you want my jokes to get better, you should subscribe. This is a threat. There are a few Gen 1 oddities that make these Pokemon even more fearsome, such as the presence of a combined special stat instead of a split special attack and special defense stat. But on top of the Pokemon themselves being strong, Psychic had pretty nutty relationships with the other types. It was only resisted by other Psychic types, meaning if you had one of your fast and strong Psychic types in position, your opponent's only option was to switch in their own Psychic type or take a big chunk of damage. Plus, Psychic's only weaknesses were Bug and Ghost, with the only Ghost type Pokemon being Gengar, who is weak to Psychic, and the only Ghost type attack being Lick. Gen 1 Psychic types weren't especially superstitious, and even if there had been more Ghost type moves, it wouldn't have mattered, since, due to a bug, Psychic types were accidentally immune to Ghost type attacks instead of weak to them. Speaking of Bug, Psychic's other weakness wasn't much scarier. The Bug types in Gen 1 are incredibly weak Pokemon, and they also had no real moves at the time. Pinsir didn't even learn a Bug type attack, for crying out loud. Looking back, it's easy to see how Psychic types went completely unchecked. Now, it's clear that going into Generation 2, Game Freak still wanted Psychic to be Grandma's most specialist type. The introduction of Lugia as a Psychic and Flying type, despite the fact that all signs pointed to it making more sense as a Water and Flying type, since, it is canonically the Guardian of the Seas, only emphasized that Psychic was meant to sit atop the throne. And that's not even mentioning that the only new mythical Pokemon was this Psychic type Onion. But something had to change, or else this new batch of mental monstrosities would spend another generation more untouched than a PSA 10 Charizard. And you probably know the solution that Game Freak came up with: the introduction of 2 new types, Steel and Dark. Steel types resist Psychic, and Dark types were not only completely immune to Psychic attacks, they could deal super effective damage in return. Add on to this Ghost attacks, actually working, and it looked like Psychic types might be manageable, at least from a type relationship standpoint. A big question though would be how the new Steel, Ghost, Dark, and Bug type Pokemon would stack up against the defending champs. Now, not every new Pokemon was good, but Generation 2 introduced several Pokemon that would eventually become competitive mainstays, such as Scizor and Tyranitar. Add on to this the splitting of the special stat into special attack and special defense, offering a major nerf to Pokemon like Alakazam, Jinx, Starmie, and actually most other psychic types, and things have been dramatically shaken up since the generation prior. I didn't play Pokemon competitively back in Generation 2. As far as I'm aware, there weren't even official tournaments back then. So at this point, it is a little bit hard to say just how dominant psychic types actually were. But what I can say is that by introducing 2 new types with the sole purpose of giving Alakazam and friends a brain freeze, and updating the stat system to allow counterplay for special attacking Pokemon, the building blocks were in place to make sure that Psychic was, if not nerfed, at least manageable. Or that's how it was supposed to go. But somehow, between these changes introduced in Generation 2 and our current game in Generation 9, Psychic types went off the rails and ended up as one of the worst types in the game. So what happened? They added Incineroar. Wait, no, that can't be right. That didn't happen until Sun and Moon. Okay, fine. Let's look a little deeper. Part of the answer has to do with the 2 new types introduced in Generation 2. See, while these types were designed to help make psychic types more manageable, Generation 2 only introduced 100 new Pokemon, and obviously only a handful of those could be either Steel or Dark. With only 5 Pokemon lines to choose from each, and over half of the Steel and Dark type Pokemon having stats that make Spidops look, well, not good, but not as bad, Psychic was still able to shine despite the efforts of Big Pikachu, because there just weren't enough good Pokemon to stop them. It wasn't really that Dark types countered Psychic types, it was more like Tyranitar countered Psychic types. And just one Pokemon is easy enough to deal with. But the longer the series went on, the more Steel and Dark type Pokemon were introduced. Generation 3, for example, more than doubled the amount of Dark types, going from 5 lines to 12, as well as adding 5 new Steel type Pokemon, including Metagross, an incredible ball of stats who resists Psychic with both of its types, and Mawile, a Pokemon that can yap twice as efficiently. And if you want to listen to me yap twice as efficiently, then you're going to love the sponsor of today's video, Raycon. With optimized gel tips for the perfect in-ear fit, these earbuds are so comfortable, and they'll actually stay in your ears, whether you're going for a run or vibing out listening to a bearded man complain about Incineroar. Most importantly, you get amazing quality audio at half the price of other premium audio brands. Raycon earbuds make a great gift for Valentine's Day for a friend or loved one. One thing I love about my Raycon earbuds is that they're sweat and water resistant. I use my pair when running, and let's just say nobody who sees me running ever goes, "Hey, that guy is not sweaty at all." This is also great in case you're forgetful like me and risk sending them through the washing machine every once in a while. Click the link in the description box or go to buyraycon.com/Wolfey to get 15% off your Raycon purchase, plus free shipping. Thanks again to Raycon for sponsoring this video. I haven't mentioned it yet, but Ghost and Bug, probably the 2 worst types in the game at the start of the franchise, would also receive buffs the longer the series went on. Ghost type moves being able to be both physical and special starting in Generation 4 was a massive buff for special attacking ghosts like Gengar. And just like Steel and Dark, the longer the series went on, the more good ghost type Pokemon there were to choose from. In stark contrast to the first 2 generations where your literal only options were Gengar and Misdreavus. Wait, why does it look so weird? Ah, that's better. The same can be said of bug types as well. The introduction of better bug type moves was a massive deal for Pokemon who previously had to use like 20 base power leash life. And many bug type Pokemon benefited from the addition of abilities in Generation 3, such as Shedinja with its Wonder Guard, Scizor with Technician, and Parasect with Dry Skin. At the same time, Game Freak appears to have been very wary of making new psychic types too strong. Excluding legendaries, Generation 2's psychic types were relatively weak, and the same was true for Generation 3, not counting Metagross. Now, to be fair, that is excluding legendaries. Pokemon like Latios and Latios are exceptional Pokemon, but there definitely seems to be a restraint shown when designing new Pokemon that was suspiciously lacking in Generation 1. So looking at just the first handful of generations, we're starting to see a vague picture of our murder mystery. New types were introduced that had a very good matchup against psychic types, and the more new Pokemon were introduced, the more the types that could handle psychic were fleshed out. At the same time, strong new Psychic type Pokemon were few and far between, often limited to powerful and rare legendary Pokemon. But this isn't the full picture, it's just one piece of the puzzle. There's more at play here than just the introduction of new Pokemon. Let's take a step back and look at what makes Psychic types, well, Psychic type. Psychic type Pokemon as of Generation 2 had the following relationships. They deal super effective damage against fighting and poison types, they deal resisted damage to steel and psychic types, and psychic moves are unable to damage dark types. On the defensive side of things, they resist psychic and fighting attacks, and they're weak to ghost, dark, and bug type moves. I want to focus on a few things in particular here, but let's start with Psychic's offense. Psychic types only hit 2 other types for super effective damage, and neither is a type you're excited to see your starter Pokemon evolve into. Poison was, for a long time, viewed as a bottom 3 type, and fighting, it's okay, but it's not great. Now, this wasn't as big a deal in Generation 1 when Psychic types dominated, because even though there weren't that many fighting and poison types, nothing resisted Psychic except Psychic. But with Steel and Dark types popping up more and more, not being able to hit a majority of the cast for super effective damage is a much bigger issue. With more types that resist it than are weak to it, Psychic isn't able to serve as the offensive powerhouse type it once was, which is a problem especially because it also can't function very well as a defensive type. While Psychic only has 3 weaknesses, and 2 of them have never been exceedingly common types, it also doesn't have many resistances. And by it doesn't have many resistances, what I mean is its resistances are practically worthless. Fighting, a type that is never at the top of the food chain, and Psychic. Yippee! In a sense, Psychic's relationships to the other types are very similar to Normal's. Offensively, Psychic hits 2 types for super effective, while Normal doesn't hit any, and they each struggle to damage 3 types. While Psychic has 3 weaknesses, Normal only has 1, and Psychic's 2 resistances to mediocre types are comparable to Normal's immunity to Ghost, a great offensive type. The difference is that in order to offset the clear disadvantage that being a normal type gives due to the type chart, normal type Pokemon are given a host of other benefits, from wide-ranging move pools to higher than average base stats, advantages that are suspiciously absent from most Psychic types. Now, this didn't stop Psychic types from being strong in Generation 2 or from continuing to be a good type for the next several generations, but their success was built on unstable footing. The more Pokemon were released, the more new moves introduced, the more underserved types brought up to speed, the more pressure was placed on the Psychic type. And in Generation 4, another huge blow was dealt. An enormous mechanic changed, completely warping how every Pokemon game would work thereafter. See, the way the game used to work is that all moves of a type were either physical or special. If the type was Dragon or the same type as any of Eevee's evolutions, it was special. Otherwise, it's physical. That means that moves like Fire Punch, a physical move nowadays, was a special move, just like all other fire type attacks. This really helped some Pokemon and really hurt others. Many Psychic type Pokemon benefited from this system.
You could proc Quick Claw and then have the flinch.
What did I say, Brayden? What did I say?
Alakazam, for example, was able to use moves like Fire Punch and Ice Punch for coverage, since they were special moves at the time. Other Pokemon, like Gengar, were seriously held back, as Gengar's stats wanted to be a special attacker, but all Ghost and Poison type moves at the time were physical. But since basically every Psychic type preferred to be a special attacker, this pretty much only helped Psychic type Pokemon. Until Generation 4, when the physical special split occurred and suddenly, Pokemon that had never been relevant before could actually be used. We talked about Gengar, but other Pokemon like Crawdon and Sharpedo, who were previously unusable, could actually play the game. Add on to this new Dark-type Pokemon like Weavile, Spiritomb, Honchkrow, and Drapion being introduced, who could take advantage of new physical Dark-type moves, and the fact that almost no Psychic types benefited from this change, and you can probably see that this was another major nail in the wheezing. Of course, not everything about Generation 4 was disastrous for Psychic types. In addition to adding Bronzong, a strong Pokemon who I'm personally fond of for no reason in particular, Diamond and Pearl introduced a new Pokemon who would go on to prove itself as arguably the best Psychic type Pokemon of all time. Cresselia. Cresselia is a legendary Pokemon with absolutely absurd stats. While it isn't strong offensively, its incredible defensive stats allow it to actually make use of Psychic as a defensive type. Because it's so tanky, it can afford to not have that many resistances, especially with its ability making it immune to ground type moves. And with only 3 weaknesses, it's difficult to hit it for super effective damage. Now, I want to be clear that for the most part, Cresselia succeeds despite its Psychic typing, not because of it. If it were a water or electric or fire or steel type, it would probably be just as good, if not better. With one exception. Cresselia's move pool is phenomenal, and that's in large part because being a Psychic type gives it access to some very valuable supporting moves. Cresselia can control the speed of the battle with moves like Icy Wind, Thunder Wave, and Trick Room. It can boost its partner's damage output with Helping Hand. It can take control of the weather with Sunny Day. It can disrupt the battle with Skill Swap and Swagger. I even tried out a Psycho Shift Flame Orb set one time, though there's a reason that this is the first time you're hearing about it. With such a versatile move pool and incredible stats, Cresselia would go on to win the World Championships 3 times, a feat no other Pokemon has yet surpassed. But Cresselia is just a single Pokemon, and though it's a great one, it doesn't redeem the entire type. As of Generation 4, Psychic was no longer in contention for the best type in the game. That mantle had fallen to Dragon. And let me tell ya, Psychic wasn't in the discussion for runner-up.
This is disgusting. This is awful in every way.
But despite getting knocked off the mountain, Psychic was still a respectable type. It's kind of like an athlete that's past their prime who occasionally shows moments of greatness. And when you see them, you can remember how good they were at their peak. And even though they're not hogging out as hard as they used to, hey, at least they're still in the game. Going into Generation 5, Psychic types didn't make a grand recovery. They didn't receive any major buffs, and the best new Psychic type Pokemon introduced were good, but not great. Gothitelle was the standout, though it didn't receive Shadow Tag until late into Generation 5's lifespan. It seemed like at this point, Psychic had finally fallen out of favor with Game Freak. Grandma had forgotten her most specialist type. For the first time since the series' inception, there were no new Psychic type legendary Pokemon. Instead, they gave us the Genies. Yay! But Game Freak had a new problem. Dragons. Dragon was the spiritual successor to Psychic, and with the introduction of so many powerful Dragon-type Pokemon over the years, the game was once again in a state where fast and powerful attackers were met with only a single type that could resist them. This time, Steel. But many Dragon-type Pokemon learned Fire or Ground-type attacks, making Steel an unreliable counter. And the powerful new gem items introduced in Generation 5 made it so that even Steel-type Pokemon couldn't switch in safely against moves like Draco Meteor. So once again, it was clear that something had to change. And Game Freak's solution was the same as it had been a decade prior: the introduction of a new type. What wasn't clear is that this final addition to the type chart would be the death knell for the once great Psychic types. Fairy-type Pokemon were introduced in Generation 6, with a handful of new Pokemon being given the type, as well as some old Pokemon being retroactively changed. And by some definitions of the word, this change worked. Dragon-type Pokemon were no longer dominating the game. Great job! Of course, the reason they were no longer dominating is because Grandma had a new, most specialist type. And boy is it Fairy. Fairy-type Pokemon were very clearly not designed with a lot of thought given to counterplay. Despite the relatively small amount of Fairy-type Pokemon, the type was so blatantly overpowered that almost every Fairy-type Pokemon with even decent stats saw success. Azumarill, Gardevoir, Mawile, Sylveon, Klefki, Whimsicott, Togekiss, even Wigglytuff won a regional. Wigglytuff!
Your children need to know there's a devil and he hates them and he wants to ruin their life.
And don't even get me started on Xerneas. I mean it. I do not want to talk about what that Pokemon put me through. But what does the Fairy type have to do with Psychic? Fairy type is like the platonic ideal of Psychic type. Fairy type Pokemon are weak to only Poison and Steel, compared to Psychic's Ghost, Dark, and Bug. They resist Fighting, Dark, and Bug and are immune to Dragon, compared to Psychic's resistances to only Fighting and Psychic. Offensively, Fairy-type moves hit Fighting, Dark, and Dragon types for super effective damage, compared to just Fighting and Poison for Psychic. And lastly, Fairy attacks are resisted by fire, steel, and poison, compared to the psychic, steel, and dark of psychic attacks. It should be apparent pretty quickly that Fairy is just a strict upgrade compared to Psychic. One of the two types Psychic has a strictly positive matchup against is Fighting, an advantage Fairy offers as well. But you get so much more out of Fairy type Pokemon. And truthfully, out of all the changes made to Psychic over the years, I personally believe this one to be the single most devastating. Pokemon isn't a game about objective strength. While there are Pokemon that are clearly better than others and will be used more than others, there's often opportunities for weaker Pokemon that fill a specific niche or do a specific thing. The most famous example is Pachirisu, of course, though countless other Pokemon over the years have thrived despite not appearing as powerful as the Pokemon around them. There are some Pokemon that can almost never succeed though, and that's Pokemon that do the same thing as a different, more powerful Pokemon. It's the reason why we rarely see Kanto Arcanine or Hitmontop when Incineroar is around, and the reason why nobody would use Musharna instead of Cresselia. And in a sense, the addition of the Fairy type made the vast majority of Psychic type Pokemon obsolete. That isn't to say that there are no good Psychic type Pokemon. In fact, a Psychic type Pokemon has won the World Championships 5 of the 8 years since Fairy type was introduced. But the Pokemon that have won are Cresselia, Calyrex Shadow, and Lunala. Pokemon that are exceptionally powerful despite their typing, not necessarily because of it. It seems like nowadays, Psychic type Pokemon can't rely on their typing to carry them. They've got to have something else be the selling point. That being said, it does seem like Game Freak is no longer opposed to making powerful Psychic type Pokemon now that the type is more in line. Recent generations have introduced several strong Psychic types with interesting mechanics attached to them. Oranguru became the first Pokemon ever to be able to cause a partner to attack twice in a row thanks to its unique move Instruct. And in the same generation, there were a ton of powerful Psychic type legendaries. Tapu Lele was a mainstay in competitive play with its Psychic Terrain ability not only shutting down priority, but also boosting the power of all Psychic type attacks. Choice Specs and Psyche MZ Tapu Lele could output huge damage, while Choice Scarf could be used to wipe opponents out before they attacked. Not to mention that every box art legendary was, for the first time, Psychic type. Solgaleo, Lunala, Necrozma, Necrozma Duskmane, Necrozma Dawnwings, and Ultra Necrozma were all at least part Psychic type. Solgaleo was more of a niche pick, though it did see some use in competitive play, similar to Necrozma Dawnwings, but Duskmane Necrozma got second at the World Championships in 2019, in part due to the power of Ultra Necrozma, and Lunala actually won Worlds that year. Now, of course, these Pokemon did succeed in large part due to their absurd stats, secondary typing, amazing abilities, and impressive move pools, but hey, they were all Psychic types. Generation 8 introduced Hatterene and Indeedee, who would form the backbone of Trick Room teams early on, with Hatterene's strength as a Dynamax attacker and Indeedee's utility as a follow-me support Pokemon. While Hatterene has fallen off since the early days of Sword and Shield, Indeedee remains a strong Pokemon even in the current format. Sword and Shield also did something similar to what Ultra Sun and Moon did with Necrozma, and introduced another fusion-style Pokemon. Calyrex Ice Rider and Calyrex Shadow Rider are both Psychic-type Pokemon, though what makes them stand out is how good their stats are, their completely unfair ability, which is literally just two abilities smashed into one, and their signature moves, which I still can't believe are real. Calyrex Shadow won the World Championships in 2022, with Calyrex Ice finishing in the semi-finals. Which brings us to Generation 9, and the final installment in the saga of Psychic-type Pokemon thus far. Scarlet and Violet introduced a lot of Psychic types, and while some of them were, repulsive, many of them turned out to be quite strong. Armarouge saw a bunch of play this year as the spiritual successor to Hatterene, and Espathra saw some niche use as well. Some personal favorite Pokemon of mine this year were Psychic type, most notably Screamtail and Farigiraf, both of whom I won the largest tournament of all time with, though not at the same time. The final part of the DLC dropped recently, and introduced new Psychic type Paradox Pokemon, which seem to be good as well. Though we'll have to see if they can keep up now that Incineroar is back. Oh man, Incineroar is back. Also, they added this monkey, but I don't think it's very good. Anyway, now you know the whole story. How Psychic went from the king of the world to a pauper at the gates. But you also know that a Pokemon's type doesn't define it. Psychic type Pokemon continue to thrive despite all of the shortcomings of their type. And I think that's kind of cool. and maybe just a little bit mental.